This is the story of how governments learned to sell war as an investment, and how ordinary people, trying to do the right thing, bankrolled the first global financial scam. The year was 1914. Europe was exploding, and the governments leading it into chaos were about to discover something terrifying. They were broke. Modern war was expensive in a way no one had imagined. The First World War wasn't knights on horseback or glory in the trenches. It was steel, fuel, munitions, and logistics, the industrialization of death. Every bullet had a price tag, every tank a mortgage. Britain, France, Germany, all of them realized that their gold reserves, the pride of their empires, were draining faster than the blood on the front lines. So they turned to something new. Not soldiers, not colonies, citizens. Until then, the average person rarely interacted with government debt. Bonds were tools of bankers and aristocrats. But when the cost of war became unmanageable, politicians faced a choice. Either raise taxes and face revolt, or find a way to make people want to give them money. The solution was genius and sinister. They would turn debt into patriotism. In Britain, the Treasury launched what it called war loans. Posters flooded the streets, women in mourning black urging men to do their part, soldiers staring from the page with solemn eyes. If you cannot fight, finance. In Germany, they called them Kriegsanleihen, war loans. Citizens lined up outside banks, believing they were investing in victory itself. And in America, which entered the war in 1917, the campaign became a spectacle. The government didn't just sell bonds, it sold emotion. "Buy Liberty bonds," barked the posters. Uncle Sam pointing his finger. Movie stars, athletes, preachers. Everyone turned into salesmen for the Treasury. Marching bands paraded through cities. Children were told that every coin saved helped their fathers fight. The message was clear. If you loved your country, you'd lend it your savings. The truth was more complicated. These so-called Liberty bonds were, in essence, IOUs, promises by the U.S. government to repay citizens with interest after the war. But the fine print hid the catch. They'd be repaid in dollars, not in purchasing power. And when the war ended, inflation roared. Between 1917 and 1920, prices in the United States nearly doubled. That meant a $100 bond redeemed at full face value could only buy half as much as it once did. The patriotic investor got their money back, but their wealth was gone. The same story unfolded across Europe. In Britain, the 1917 war loan paid 5% interest, decent on paper. But by the early 1920s, inflation had eaten away nearly 60% of its real value. In Germany, it was worse. The government printed money to finance its war effort, assuring citizens their war loans were safe. Within a few years, hyperinflation wiped out those savings entirely. The proud, patriotic lenders of 1916 became beggars by 1923. They weren't victims of military defeat, they were victims of arithmetic. War bonds weren't designed to enrich the public. They were designed to keep the machine running. When you bought one, you weren't buying victory. You were buying time. You were funding the illusion that the system could hold just a little longer. And the governments knew exactly what they were doing. Because for them, these bond drives weren't just financial lifelines. They were propaganda campaigns. They blurred the line between morality and money so effectively that to question the investment was to question your loyalty. Posters didn't talk about interest rates. They talked about heroes. Buying a bond wasn't a transaction. It was an act of faith. And faith is the most profitable currency a government can issue. That's what made it a scam. Not the numbers, but the narrative. The public thought they were investing in the nation. But in truth, the nation was investing in them. In their obedience, their emotion, their willingness to fund something they didn't understand. The British government alone issued over £6 billion in war bonds, a staggering figure at the time. In the US, Liberty bonds raised more than $20 billion, roughly half the cost of America's entire war. It worked so well that by 1918, the modern concept of a bond market had been born. Not a niche world for elites, but a national project of persuasion. The message was universal. You weren't buying debt, you were buying honor, but honor doesn't pay interest. And when peace came, the silence was deafening. After the war, governments found themselves buried under mountains of IOUs they could never realistically repay. But default wasn't an option. You couldn't admit to your citizens that their patriotic investment had been a bad deal. So they changed the definition of payment. In Britain, the government converted its short-term war loans into long-term securities. the famous consols, bonds that would, in theory, pay interest forever but never actually mature. It was an elegant way of turning temporary patriotism into permanent debt. The holders of these bonds, ordinary families, veterans, pensioners, kept receiving small coupons for decades, unaware that their original investment had already evaporated in real terms. The war was over, but the payments never stopped. It took Britain nearly 100 years to finally retire that debt. The last of its World War I bonds were paid off in 2015, almost a century after the guns went silent. In America, the same story took a quieter form. Liberty bonds were eventually refinanced, absorbed into the vast machinery of the Treasury, laying the foundation for what we now know as the U.S. national debt. What began as an emergency wartime measure became the operating model of government finance. And so, something extraordinary had happened. The war may have ended, but the debt never did. The world had just discovered a new kind of power. Not the power to destroy, but the power to borrow forever. War bonds weren't just about funding conflict. They were about normalizing the idea that governments could borrow endlessly, as long as the people believed it was for a noble cause. Once you could sell war as an investment, you could sell anything. And that's where the scam becomes genius. Because what started as a desperate experiment in 1914 became the foundation of modern economics. The marriage between patriotism and debt, emotion and money, turned out to be one of the most enduring alliances in history. The modern citizen didn't just fight for their country, they financed it, willingly. And for the governments of the world, that realization changed everything. By the time the Second World War began, governments didn't even need to invent new rhetoric. The bond drives returned, this time with Hollywood polish. In the United States, the War Bond Office enlisted stars like Rita Hayworth and Clark Gable to sell bonds from movie screens. Walt Disney drew cartoons about patriotic savings. Even Bugs Bunny told Americans to buy bonds. It was financial theater at its finest. Citizens once again lined up to buy victory, and once again the returns melted away in post-war inflation. But no one cared, because the habit had become instinct. Borrowing wasn't shameful anymore, it was patriotic. Governments had cracked the code. The safest creditor in history isn't a bank. It's the citizen who believes he's part of the mission. And once that psychological switch flipped, the world's financial system would never be the same. After 1945, something remarkable happened. The old empires, Britain, France, Japan, were broken. But one new empire had risen, built not on conquest, but on credit. The United States. The dollar replaced gold as the world's anchor. The U.S. Treasury market, born from those old Liberty bonds, became the global safe haven. Central banks, corporations, and foreign governments all bought American debt, treating it as wealth itself. What had once been wartime propaganda was now the foundation of global finance. The entire modern economy, from your mortgage to your mutual fund, rests on that same idea. Trust the debt. And every time a government faces crisis, the pattern repeats. During the Cold War, buy savings bonds, support the troops. After 9/11, buy treasuries, defend freedom. During the pandemic, stimulus now, debt later, different wars, same mechanism. It always begins with emotion, security, fear, pride, and ends with numbers on a spreadsheet. The brilliance of the original war bonds wasn't that they raised money, it's that they blurred the line between saving and obedience. When you bought one, you weren't just funding the war, you were declaring faith in the system itself, and that faith became the real currency. Governments learned that as long as people believed, the numbers didn't matter. You could promise returns you'd never deliver, issue debt you'd never repay, and inflate away the losses, all without losing legitimacy. Because in the end, the bondholder and the soldier were the same, both loyal, both expendable, both convinced their sacrifice served a higher cause. The parallels today are hard to ignore. Modern bonds go by new names: green bonds, recovery bonds, defense bills, treasuries, sovereign debt. But the logic hasn't changed. Every crisis is financed the same way. Governments borrow in your name, with your money, and sell it back to you as moral duty. Instead of posters with soldiers, you get economists on TV telling you it's for stability. Instead of flags, there are slogans about sustainability or resilience, but the message is identical. Lend us your future so we can save the present. The war never really ends, it just changes shape. It might be a war on poverty, on terror, on climate change, or on recession, but the funding mechanism, the emotional bait, stays the same. You're not just a citizen anymore, you're collateral. The deeper truth behind the war bond story is this. It was never about financing war. It was about financing trust. Before 1914, people trusted gold, savings, and hard assets. After 1918, they trusted the state. The war didn't just reshape borders, it rewired human psychology. That's why every modern financial crisis echoes that original template. When fear spikes, governments don't ask you to save yourself, they ask you to save them. And you do, because you've been taught to believe that your safety and the system's survival are the same thing. That's the true inheritance of the war bond era. Not a debt on the books, but a belief in the illusion of repayment. History's great irony is that war bonds worked too well. They taught the world how to run an economy without limits, where every emergency justifies more borrowing and every promise can be delayed indefinitely. From the trenches of 1917 to the spreadsheets of 2025, the same pattern holds. If people believe, the money is infinite. But belief isn't free. Inflation, stagnation, and widening inequality are the price we still pay for that illusion. Because when a government discovers it can always borrow from tomorrow, it stops being careful with today. And that is the legacy of the first global financial scam. The poster said, "If you can't fight, finance." A century later, it's no longer a slogan. It's a system. The world still runs on war bonds. We just stopped calling them that. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.